The People Analytics Podcast is brought to you by hiQ Labs, recipient of the Human Resource Executives 2016 Top HR Product Award. For more information about hiQ Labs, please visit us at www.hiqlabs.com.
This week on the hiQ People Analytics Podcast.
Hi, I'm Beverly Tarulli from PepsiCo. Listen as Michael Hausman and I discuss how workforce analytics is changing the way we practice HR.
Hey, podcast listener, thanks for tuning in. I'm your workforce scientist and podcast host, Michael Hausman. I'm really excited to have Beverly Tarulli on. She's the Vice President of Human Capital Strategy and Workforce Analytics at PepsiCo and has been there for almost 10 years. Beverly, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, Mike.
Yeah, absolutely. And you like to sort of frame this conversation by getting a sense of your background. So maybe you can just tell us about how you got into people analytics in the first place.
Well, my academic background is, PhD in IO psychology, pretty traditional, emphasis on the I primarily. So I've been doing really evidence-based work for my entire career. I've been in internal roles in companies as well as consulting. And so at PepsiCo, when the opportunity arose for someone to head up this role, our CHRO asked me to do it based on my previous work. So, I kind of jumped at it because it sounded pretty exciting and kind of interesting and a little bit different than what I had done before.
Cool. And actually, you're the first IO psychologist that we've had on the show. So maybe take a little detour. Tell, for the listeners, first, what does the IO mean? And B, what is it you learn as an IO psychologist? How does that kind of prepare you for the role you have now?
Yeah, well, the IO means Industrial and Organizational Psychology. My program in particular was more on the kind of industrial side, meaning more traditional quantitative type of role. So some of the things I learned how to do early on, and my first job was really developing selection programs. How do you hire people? What kinds of tests do you develop? How do you put tests together to build regression models to predict who's going to be successful in their jobs? But it also spans things like, what are some of the organizational types of factors that influence individual and organizational performance? That's kind of the O side of things.
The work you're doing in human capital strategy and workforce analytics obviously spans a really wide kind of array of skills and responsibilities. So, I guess I'm wondering, how many hats are you wearing in the course of a day? Like, what are those hats that you have to put on and take off?
Well, I guess if you look at my title, I have at least two hats, right? So, I have a team of people here who are really focused on doing the analytics work, and I obviously direct and advise them on very specific activities and projects that we're doing. But I also have responsibility for developing our long-term human capital strategy, and by long-term I mean really 3 to 5 plus years out. But when you think about it, these two things make perfect sense together. They're really complementary because a lot of the work that we do on the analytics team and the insights that we generate, really feed into our strategic direction. But, that's sort of two hats. But then I'm sort of the CHRO's research arm. So when she has special requests, they kind of come to me and my team. So it could be anything from something that the CEO has on her mind or just, interesting research questions. And then, the last sort of hat I wear, I guess, is just helping the organization to build analytics capabilities in general within the HR function. So one of the things we've done, for example, is we've developed an action learning program that we have selected people go through, and it's a year-long program where they actually work on an analytics project and, have to learn how to get into some of the details of setting up an analytics project and actually running the data analyses and drawing the insights.
And, I want to get everyone listening a sense of kind of the breadth and depth of the HR and Pepsi in general. Before we talk a little bit about some of those activities, people think PepsiCo, they just think of, the bottled drink that's sitting on the shelf. Tell us, how many employees are we talking about? What sort of geographies does this span? This is a major corporation, right? We're
a global company. We have about just over 260,000 employees, which I think surprises a lot of people. But when you really think about it, we are an operating company. So we have plants all over the place. We have salespeople all over the place. So that constitutes the bulk of our population. But to your point, we don't just produce soda. We're actually a reasonably diversified food and beverage company. So in addition to our beverages, the traditional carbonated soft drinks, we also produce water and juice. We even have some dairy operations in various parts of the world, the biggest one being in Russia. And then on the food side, we have two pieces of that world, which are snacks, and you might know many of them, Frito-Lay products, as well as our Quaker products like Gatorade and Stacy's and Naked Juices and things that people don't necessarily associate with PepsiCo.
It's amazing, how many things have that PepsiCo label on them. And I guess when we're talking about 260,000 employees across, it's multinational, maybe you could talk about some of the unique challenges that poses in terms of analytics and workforce planning.
Just getting the data for all those people is pretty challenging. We are in the process of implementing our ERP all over, so hopefully by the end of this year we'll have most of our data in one place. And when I say most, some of our frontline data still won't be there. And those are really difficult challenges because, it's just hard to get to those data unless you go literally person by person out in the field. In addition, when you have a pretty diversified workforce like that, you have different compensation structures for salespeople, for example, versus frontline people versus, professionals and executives. So, the way the data is presented to us can be pretty complicated.
That's a great way to segue to kind of your people analytics journey at PepsiCo. Can you describe, what were the challenges that you faced when you started and kind of where was it then and where is it now?
We started the workforce analytics function of PepsiCo about 4 years ago. And, to her credit, it was our CHRO who really was determined to set something up here. She's actually a PhD chemist, so she had a real appreciation for, scientific thinking and the use of data. So at the beginning, and I wasn't involved obviously in the early days, but we built a small team, primarily consultants. And the function was built around three areas primarily. One was kind of models that predict workforce outcomes. So, the typical things you think of when you often think about workforce analytics, which is, who gets promoted and why, what drives retention, what drives attrition in the organization. Then secondly, was something we called strategic workforce planning. So this is a process where we go and identify, based on business strategies, what are the capability gaps that we have based on our current business strategy. And then the third kind of chunk of work that we set up was something we call workforce optimization, which is really projects that help us predict business outcomes, working very closely with the business. And in the first 3 years, I would say it was pretty foundational. We really built primarily in the areas of those prediction models and strategic workforce planning, but also a good bit of time, as you might expect, was really just setting up, building databases, cleaning the data. And I think what people tend to underestimate and undervalue is the critical nature of doing that kind of work. Even things that nobody sees are very important when you're doing a workforce planning, workforce analytics function, like building data dictionaries. So everybody has the same reference tool that they're working off of. So when I took over about a little over a year ago, it was a pretty well-functioning team, well-staffed, highly functioning, but we did have some things that we needed to really optimize, which we weren't doing. So, an example is those strategic workforce plans. We completed 7 of those in the first few years of the function in some of our growth markets, but what I found out was nobody was really tracking what was happening with them. So, you identify the capability gaps and you build these plans about how to fill those gaps. And then the question is, well, are we making any progress on them? So today that's actually an agenda item for both our CHR and our CEO, and we report out on that every quarter to them. So, there were just some things that we needed to fine-tune and kind of enhance. But, the basics were really there.
And with those foundational activities, like you had mentioned, hey, we're at the point now where we're happy with the data and it's in one place. But, I don't imagine you can just tell the organization and the CHRO, hey, wait a few years while we get the data in a good place. So is it hard to, show small wins while you're also building up the foundational work and kind of trying to get things moving there?
Well, it's very interesting that you asked that question because I'm not sure some of our senior HR people were really not only not aware of our function, maybe, I mean, they were aware of it, but weren't really, knocking on the door going, hey, we need some analytics stuff here. And in fact, that was one of the initial challenges, was trying to demonstrate, your value to the organization early on. And so, yes, it's absolutely critical to get some of those quick wins. And it's not that easy because, to your point, even building the models, cleaning the data, building the models, deriving the insights takes a significant amount of time. I wouldn't say it took years, but it probably took the good part of a year to do.
Around that building legitimacy and kind of showing them value, like what were the lessons learned for you? I'm wondering what advice you'd give to someone that's just starting off down this path.
Well, for me, when I first came into the role, the first thing I did was I actually sat down and interviewed all of our senior HR folks. So those would be the HR leaders in each of our sectors around the world. And I kind of said, just open-ended questions. What do you think of the function? What are you getting from it? Are you deriving any value from it? And to be honest, it was kind of a mixed review. Some people thought it was great and they were really gung-ho about it. Some people are saying, yeah, I get really high-quality work from your team, but I'm not really sure what to do with it on a day-to-day basis. And, part of that in terms of building the credibility is just getting better over time and demonstrating to them. So drawing the insights isn't enough. I could say, oh, well, here's what we found. But the fact of the matter is you got to help them understand what that means for them and how they can use that information. And it's really, the credibility building is really just something you develop over time as you demonstrate, what they can do with the information that you're generating.
I love that, and the analogy that I use is the kind of classic tree falling in the forest euphemism, right? If you do the analysis and you hand it off and then nothing happens, did you even really do it? And so I think that's huge, that people know they have to kind of do a little hand-holding, right? You've got to work with those stakeholders and HR business partners to make sure that they're getting value from the really cool work that you're doing. And
it's interesting that you say that, because I call that being more consultative. I mean, analytics people, at least on my team, and just as an aside, the skill sets are really interesting and diverse on my team, because people kind of think, well, you asked the question about IO psychology. Well, on my team I have sociologists, I have economists, I have psychologists, and I actually have a chemist. So it's not just a certain profile of people that I'm looking for. It's in terms of academic background, it's more of a way of thinking about things. But these folks are used to generating data in a lot of cases just to generate data. And so, part of the challenge for analytics people, I think, is really telling the story and pulling all the data points together to tell a broader story, right? Because I think we can do all these little projects and you get all these little insights, but then you pull them together in a way that makes it really meaningful for the audience that you're talking with, and that's really the challenge. And analytics people are not naturally good at that.
Yeah. So what piece of that do you think is really kind of the biggest challenge? Is it the data and aggregation, or is it the generating insight, or working with HR business practitioners? Like, where do you think was kind of the biggest learning curve for you?
I mean, all those things are challenges, right? I mean, I think you could say, wow, data cleaning and aggregation, but most of that stuff's just time consuming. It's not really a challenge. Once you know where the data is, it's just a matter of pulling it in, aggregating it into one database, making sure the data is as clean as it can be. But that's not really, I don't think the biggest challenge. Finding the right talent can be a challenge, especially now because it's such a hot market. For me, the greatest challenge is really to help my team not just generate those insights, but really tell the story. And it's I don't know how to tell somebody to do that. It's sort of, you work over time to just make sure that every deck you present, every time you present, you're telling it in a way that resonates with whatever audience. And sometimes it's an HR audience who cares about different things than a business partner audience, right? The actual functional or business leaders.
The storytelling is key, right? That's, I think, how people think. And so, you can throw a lot of data and numbers at them, but I think if you can tell a story, you're going to capture their attention, right? They kind of you want to have the beginning, middle, and end, right?
It's funny because I don't know if you've seen some of the videos that another company that does great analytics put out, but this one individual is talking about the emotional aspect of the story too. I mean, again, analytics tends to be pretty dry and in some cases not particularly emotional, right? So if you can figure out how to tell the story in a way that evokes some kind of emotion, I think that's really powerful.
Absolutely. And looking back on what you've done, obviously you've got, plenty ahead of you, but what is it that you're most proud of that you've achieved in your current role?
I think I would say that I think we have made progress on, convincing our senior HR leaders of the value of the work. I mean, just recently we were meeting with all of them to update our prediction, our retention models, and talking about, what our models showed and really showing them how we're classifying people based on the factors that lead them to potentially be a high risk of loss. And we're getting great feedback from them. We've improved our accuracy on those models actually over the last year by about 32%. So we're actually getting much more accurate in our models by bringing in additional data. But they're actually starting to see now, okay, this is what I can do with that. And I think the real unlock here was not just handing them a list of people saying, here are people who might be at a high risk of loss, but rather, and here's why. We have these different profiles. Person X falls into this category, and thus that might suggest certain types of interventions if you want to try to keep them. Well, person Y falls into another profile, and that suggests some other things that you could be doing. So it was really taking that more consultative approach with our HR business partners and saying, and here's what you can do with the information that we're giving you. And I think that was a key unlock for us.
Let's talk a little less about PepsiCo and more about people analytics in general, because again, you've been doing this for a while and you've seen changes and the whole space has evolved. So more broadly, what do you think of the space, and are there any developments or trends or technology that make you really excited?
It's an interesting space to me because it's been so hot for the last year or so. And I do think we're going to kind of reach a plateau in the excitement level around workforce analytics. I guess depending upon what data you believe, there's a number of studies out there. About half of the employers out there say they're actually using data analytics, but something like less than 10% are really doing sort of advanced predictive analytics. And I do think there's a definitional issue because analytics means everything from reporting to, very sophisticated models out there. But frankly, I just think there's a lot of room for the function to mature in every organization, including ours. So I don't get excited about a specific technology per se. I get more excited about what we can do with the technology in order to create something really interesting for the business. And for me, I think the opportunity area is really getting, and it's something we haven't cracked yet, but getting closer to the business, working directly with the business, not so much with the HR people, to really help them predict business outcomes. And that's something I think I haven't heard a lot of people in this space talk about. I think a lot of them are still, every time I go to a conference, we're still talking about retention model. So this is an area that gets me excited because I think that's the real unlock for really, making workforce analytics a space within HR and within businesses that really is going to be a lasting one.
I think a lot of people get kind of seduced by all the new tools and technologies and techniques that are out there, and it's great and it can be a little sexy, but you make a great point, which is at the end of the day, it needs to create value for the business, it needs to drive change, and that's that's ultimately what's going to allow this to be embraced by companies.
Honestly, it's kind of like getting excited about a hammer instead of the house that you're building. I don't know that would excite me too much.
It's a great point. And the other thing is, look, there's a saying that I love, which is that the future is here. It's just unevenly distributed. So there's so much cool stuff going on, but at the end of the day, the adoption is we're still early on, right? We have 8% of companies engaging in quote unquote predictive analytics, and it's hard to even define what that is. So I think you're right that I think it's less about kind of what's on the horizon and more about, hey, can we get more and more companies and more business leaders farther along in that adoption curve?
I get really excited just by seeing people finally relying on data in HR because I think it's one of those areas that's long overdue. I mean, HR has been such a gut-driven function for so long. But I do worry, and Michael, that on the flip side that we might go a little bit overboard and rely too much on data as opposed to kind of, balancing between, here's what the data says, and here's kind of what my judgment tells me based on my experience. And I think we got to land somewhere in the middle. So I don't want to over-index on one side or the other. I think it's, we've got to figure out what the good middle ground is.
It's a concern I think a lot of people have, but they haven't talked about it as much. I mean, do you think there's a good way to make sure that what we're doing is a mix of the human intuition and data? Like, how do we make sure we don't veer towards one too much, or the other?
Well, I mean, I think honestly part of it is just making sure that, the HR business partners that we work with have some minimal knowledge and capability around statistics and analytics, because if they don't understand what we're giving them, they can overinterpret, right? So, people get all excited when, you give them, a prediction model, but they don't understand that at the end of the day, there's still a lot of times when we're going to be wrong, like we might predict somebody's going to leave and they don't, or vice versa. And the fact that it's still, with all the variables that we use in there, we're still only accounting for a pretty small percentage of the variability in human behavior, right? So if you don't understand some of those basics, you can kind of say, wow, well, it's based on some kind of, statistical model, so it must be right. And I think it's just an educational process, frankly, and, that's some heavy lifting when you have a reasonably large HR organization. And some people will get there and some people won't, frankly.
Yeah, I completely agree. I'll share one quick story that, presenting results with the assessment work that I'd done years ago, and someone in the room said, hey, you need to recalibrate this assessment because you gave someone a green score and they made it one day into the job and they that was it. They quit. And, for that, it's hard to explain. Okay, these are not deterministic. There's some randomness here, but it's right a lot more than it's wrong. Like, you almost have to go back to stats 101, right? Because that shouldn't undermine your belief in how good the models are. It should you should understand it's not always right. It's not always wrong.
That's right. That's right. I mean, the other thing that we're trying to do is also incorporate some of those judgments into our model. So we didn't do it for this year, but for next year, we're going to go out and ask the HR business partners to tell us who they think has a high a risk of loss, and incorporate those into our model and see if it adds anything to our ability to be accurate in our predictions. So kind of using the more qualitative types of data in the models, I think might be interesting to look at.
I love that. Plus, you kind of factor in those a priori assumptions, right? You can then come back and say, hey, before you saw the estimates, this is who you thought was at risk. You're maybe now more, we can add some fidelity to your guess by adding in data. So I think that's great. We need to check back in with you when you get the results of that, because that's a really clever idea. What, kind of lastly, and we touched on this earlier, but, we want to recognize that not all companies are as sophisticated as PepsiCo with this, and a lot are just starting up on their journey. So, for someone that said, hey, Beverly, I'm on day one at my job, and it's a company that's relatively large, what should I be doing? What would your advice be?
The first thing I would do is hire some really smart people, who, and, helps if they've done analytics work before, but frankly, I'm not sure that that's critical. But you need some people who can really help you think about how to achieve what you're trying to do. Team building 101, whether it's analytics or anything else. I mean, I always like to find people who are pretty smart and can help me think through things, as opposed to me having all the answers. And then I think the second thing I would tell them is, related back to the point about the foundational and fundamental stuff, it's not fun stuff, but you have to do it right at the beginning, because it's time well spent. If you spend the time to get all the basics right, make sure you've got a good process, you've got ways, common ways to document things, getting all the sort of blocking and tackling done. I think that will go a long way before you start to jump in and really start to crank out models and things based on some messy data and maybe some unreplicatable types of processes. And understand it's just going to take some time. I mean, again, we have a pretty robust HRIS system, and it's getting better every day, but some companies don't have that, and I'm sure there are going to be a lot of them that have to reach into different HR systems just to get, a consolidated view of the data, and it's going to take a significant amount of time. And lastly, it's an interesting question, but you got to decide what level of accuracy you're going to tolerate with your data too, because it's never going to be 100% accurate. I've never seen a company, both in my consulting world and here at PepsiCo, where the data on any given day is 100% accurate. And then lastly, I'd say, once you get all those foundational things going, try to get some of those quick wins to showcase, the value of the investment that the company's making in setting up the workforce analytics. No matter how small, if it's an interesting insight, try to get it out there and socialized.
Really, really insightful stuff. And I want to thank Beverly for her time. If folks enjoyed this conversation, can they follow you on Twitter? You speak at conferences. How would someone go about kind of keeping up with some of the stuff that you're doing?
I do conferences. I'm on LinkedIn. Or just you can find me. I'm out there in the universe. So I don't do a lot of writing on this. I don't have time to do that, but I'd be happy to share what we're doing. And I'm always interested in networking. And by the way, hiQ has been terrific that way. They've hooked me up with a lot of interesting people that are doing this work. So that's another way to reach me.
I'm blushing now. I appreciate the shout out. Thanks so much. I'd also like to thank everyone that made this podcast possible. Our executive producer, Jennifer Kaplan, the show's producer, Matt DeSantis, and our sound engineer, John Bacchian. And most importantly, I'd like to thank you, the listener, for downloading the hiQ People Analytics podcast. The People Analytics podcast is now available wherever you find your favorite podcasts. iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, iHeartRadio. We are at your fingertips. Simply Google hiQ Podcast to find your favorite platform. And once you do, please subscribe, rate, and review us. By subscribing, you can be sure that you don't miss a single episode. By rating it, you can help others find us. And by leaving a review, you can play an important role in shaping the conversations surrounding people analytics. Until next time, I'm Michael Hausman. Have a data-driven day.
Thank you for listening to the People Analytics Podcast. For more information about hiQ, you can visit us at www.hiqlabs.com and to join the conversation by following us at LinkedIn and Twitter at hiQ Labs.